Anti-D Law welcomes you to the 7-day course for the LSAT-India. In this course, you will receive 7 lessons each for logical reasoning, analytical reasoning, and reading comprehension. So let's begin with today's lecture. Today's lesson is RC4, our 4th lesson on reading comprehension. But I'd strongly recommend that you saw RC1, RC2 and RC3 before you looked at RC4. In fact, at the very least, I strongly recommend that you watched at least RC1. The link to the RC1 is here available by clicking the I button on the top right of the screen here. If you click here, you can have a look at RC1. Watch RC1 first and then come back to RC4. This video is RC4, our 4th lesson on reading comprehension, and before this we've had RC1, RC2 and RC3. I very strongly recommend that you watch these videos first because I've given you some foundational principles there in detail. Those principles will help you solve any question, right? Those are general principles that can be applied to all questions. So I strongly recommend that you watch those first, but still for the sake of comfort, I will briefly repeat those for you now. Okay. Remember that you are to read the passage that is given to you, one paragraph at a time. So typically, your passage would be like this, that it contains, say, 3 paragraphs. Okay, so this is your passage, right? So your passage may contain perhaps 2 or 3 sentences. You don't pause after reading every sentence or after reading every couple of words. You read one paragraph in one go, and then you take a moment and ensure that you are able to comprehend it. What that means is that, let's say you've read this paragraph, you just pause after you've read the first paragraph to see if you have been able to comprehend it. And then if you think you've been able to comprehend it, then you go to your next paragraph, and then you go to your next paragraph if you've been able to do that. In case you feel that you've not been able to comprehend it, read it again. So if someone asks me as to how many times one must read a passage or how many times one must read, that totally depends on how long it takes you to comprehend. Let me tell you about myself. Generally, I am unable to comprehend in the first attempt. It takes me sometimes 2 or even 3 readings to comprehend a paragraph or a passage. And as I always say, what is more important is accuracy and not speed. Now the question is, how do you know that you have been able to comprehend? For that, there are some indicators. The first is that, let us say you have read this paragraph. Now we want to test whether you have been able to comprehend it or not. So let's look at your checklist. Are you able to make a summary of that paragraph in your head in a couple of points, say 1 or 2 points? Let us say you are. It means that perhaps you have been able to comprehend it. Next, and perhaps this is the most important tool that I would give you in reading comprehension. Let us say you have read the first paragraph, okay, and if you've been able to comprehend it, what that means is you would have now got the ability to predict or anticipate what is going to happen next. So whenever you're watching a movie, there's a build-up, and then there's the climax or the anti-climax or whatever. So if you have been able to understand the build-up, then the climax makes sense to you, right? Now your prediction might be that A is the killer rather than B. Let's say you're watching a crime movie or whatever. So you're seeing the build-up, and the build-up points towards somebody being the killer. Now, it does not matter whether it is A or whether it is B. What is important is, were you able to at least think that, okay, perhaps he may be doing it, perhaps he may be doing it. That means you've at least understood the movie. The same thing has to happen with the reading comprehension passage. You should be able to anticipate what is going to happen next. So, if you're able to anticipate, it means I'd say that you are able to comprehend. The next thing that you should be able to do is that while reading the passage, are you able to think of what the questions would be like? If you're able to predict the questions, and this is also something that can grow with practice, it means that you have been able to look into the mind of the person who has framed the questions for you. So if you can summarize the paragraph, you can anticipate the next paragraph, and if you can also predict the questions and also perhaps the options, right? Then it means you have been able to understand it. In case this does not happen in the first reading, go for a second. If not the second, go for a third. Reread it if required. It is not a problem. Do not feel any kind of shame in having to reread the problem. Like I said, what is more important is accuracy speed will come, and even if you do not have speed, it is all right. You don't need to get too many questions right in order to score well. If I were to give you a ballpark figure, if you can manage to score 50% marks, right? If you can score 50% marks in the LSAT India, my informed guess, because we don't have the details from the LSAT India, my informed guess is that you would get a score of 90 percentile, right? If you can score 50% marks, you will get 90 percentile. So which means that in 35 minutes, you do not need to solve all 25 questions. You can just solve 13 questions, but get them right, all right? Once you have these things, reading comprehension is quite easy. So we'll look at these principles in today's question, and we'll go a little fast because, like I said, we'll try to be accurate but slightly step up the speed. Before you listen to my solution, perhaps you may want to try the question out by your own self. In fact, I recommend that you at least read this once before you listen to my explanation, because you can't read it as I speak, and I will not read it with you, because if I were to take the pen and read this along with you, it would waste our precious time. Okay, so I'll also show you the questions. So I will show you the questions, so you can go back and forth. You can forward the video or go back and have a look at the passage as well as the questions. So now I'll show you the questions. So there are 5 questions in this passage, as you can see here. I will show you these one by one, and then you can pause the video and attempt the questions if you'd like. You can have a look. This is the first question. This is the second question. You have the third question, the fourth question, and the fifth question. So what you can do is that you can go back and forth and read all of these if you like, but the least you should do before going any further is to pause the video and at least read this once, so that you are aware of what is contained in the passage. Do not proceed any further without reading this, all right? You may not solve the questions if you don't want to, but make sure you do at least this. All right, so now we'll go ahead and solve this problem together. I'd be dividing this solution into 2 parts. The first is what you're seeing in RC4, the present video, and then the other one would be RC5. You see, my objective here is to teach you how to fish rather than to give you some fish, right? Because if I teach you how to fish, then you can go ahead and solve any question. So what we'll do in RC4 is that I will analyze the passage for you in great detail. So I'll show you the method of analyzing and understanding the passage, right? And we'll go ahead and solve the questions in RC5. So make sure that you watch both of these videos. Also, this video, again, like the other RC videos, would be very detailed, because detailing is important. That is how you can analyze the passage, and that's how you can actually benefit from this video. Even if you watch this one video along with RC5, you'd be able to benefit immensely and perform much better in reading comprehension. So make sure you don't get bored, make sure you stay patient and follow the steps that I ask you to. So we'll try to follow the steps that we had decided to follow, all right? So you can see this is the first paragraph, this is the second paragraph, and this is the third. So we decided that we would see the passage one paragraph at a time. So let's do that right away. This is the first paragraph that I have reformatted for you. We will try to make some sense of the first paragraph, get a few points, get the summary, and then perhaps anticipate what is going to happen next, and then go on to the second paragraph, and then do the same with the third as well. So take a moment and try to summarize this paragraph for your own self if you've not already done it. If you have, let's just go ahead. When you look at the first sentence, when you look at this first sentence here, I assume we all believe that bats have experience. It's a very short, crisp and complete first line. So it's important that you gather this one point from us. He says that all of us do believe that bats have experience. So we gather the meaning from this point first. Then when he says after all, when you see this word after all, it's like he's further explaining the point that has been made here. So here he's made a point, and then when you say after all, this, what you can see is that when you see something like after all, okay, you're going to further substantiate that point. you're going to talk more about that point only. So what he's basically saying here is that just as we believe that mice, pigeons and whales have experience, like that we can believe the same about bats. So he's basically just building upon the point that he has made here. Okay. Then when we go to the next line, here you see that perhaps he is now introducing the point that is slightly different. So what he says here is, let me just highlight this for you. He says that bats, although more closely related to us than those other species, nevertheless present a range of activity and a sensory apparatus so different from ours that the problem I want to pose is exceptionally vivid, though it certainly could be raised with other species. Now you have got the problem, and the problem is that of a long sentence, right? Whenever you see a long sentence, you know what you have to do. You have to break it down. Okay? And how do you break it down? You break it down by finding what is given between two commas. You can always remove, not always, you can many times remove what is given between two commas because it's generally a qualifier. In grammar, it's often called the adjective clause. So you can remove this and then add it back. Okay. Also, whatever is given in the brackets can first be deleted in your head and then you can bring it back. So let's see how we can break this long sentence and try to get some meaning of it. And if we can get the meaning, then we can proceed a little further. Okay. So let me just black out portions that I feel can be omitted. I have done this and explained this to you in the other videos of RC as well. So you can go have a look at those as well. So let me just first black out what is given in the brackets. Okay. Also here you can see between this comma here and the comma here, this is a clause that is giving you some additional data. Since this is too much data in one sentence, I'll try to black this out as well. Alright, now what remains is a shorter sentence, and let us see if we can understand what is being said. So we know what was there before this, right? Before this sentence, there's a point. That is our context. So before this he said, bats have experience. This is what has been said before this, okay? Now let's read the sentence. It says, goes on to say, bats nevertheless present a range of activity and sensory apparatus so different from ours that the problem I want to pose is exceptionally vivid. He says that although we do believe that bats have experience, okay, he says, okay, bats do have experience, but bats present a range of activity which is so different from us. So bats are very different from humans, okay? And he says that the problem that I want to pose, which means that he will be giving the problem. He would be telling you the problem next. So he says, I want to pose, which means you know that the problem is going to follow. This is what I call anticipation. When you can understand this one line, you know that he is now going to tell you the problem. Okay. So he says that he has picked the example of bats because they are so different from humans that the problem would be exceptionally vivid. So when something is vivid, it means it's very clear. So he's going to talk about a problem. He has said that he will talk about a problem. And he says that for that, he is using bats as an example. And he is doing this so that the problem that he speaks of is made using a very vivid example of bats, because bats are so different from humans in their sensory. So once I add back this part that we had deleted, what we can see in green is that bats, although more closely related to us than those other species. So what you can see here is that he is taking the examples of bats, although they are more closely related to us perhaps than pigeons or whales or mice. What he means to say that perhaps we look or resemble bats more than pigeons or whales, but he's taking the example of bats because of their different sensory apparatus. And then he says he's going to pose a problem, right? And within brackets he says that he could have also raised this problems with some other species, which means that he is going to use bats to pose the problem, but he could have posed the problem using some other species. He could have used mice, He could have perhaps used whales or some other species as well. So you see, it's very simple to add back these details which are in green right now once you've understood what is in yellow. So make sure that when you read a passage in the exam, you follow this procedure, okay? It's taking a lot of time in this video, but when you do that, actually when you're solving the question, you just simply have to ignore a certain part. You just ignore this part first and then you add it back, and that is how you make sense, okay? So now that we've done this, it would be quite simple to now look at the last paragraph here. Let's look at the last paragraph. Even without the benefit of philosophical reflection, anyone who has spent some time in an enclosed space with an excited bat knows what it is to encounter a fundamentally alien form of life. So he's not raised the problem here, which means that the problem will be in the next paragraph, right? Or perhaps in the paragraph after that, okay? All he says here is essentially that anyone who has spent some time with a bat, right, knows that it is a different form of life. That is all. I think we've been able to make sense of the first paragraph since we have our 2 or 3 points. The 2 or 3 points that I have is, first, that bats have experience. We all agree. Second, their experience is going to be very different from ours. In fact, what it does not talk of experience. It says that the first point is that bats have experience. Second, they have a very different way of experiencing life because they have a different sensory apparatus. And then third, he goes on to say that if we've spent time with the bat, we know it is very different. It's an alien form of life. Now that we've understood this, let's go ahead. So now when we look at our second paragraph, we are essentially looking for the problem that was spoken of in the first paragraph, right? So that is what gives us some context. That is the anticipation that we bring to the second paragraph. This is what we anticipate. This is what we bring from paragraph number 1. Now let's see what has been said in this passage here, okay? So I'll highlight this for you and we'll read along. He says that I have said that the essence of the belief that bats have experience is that there is something like it is to be a bat, right? So what he says is that, let us say, if I have the experience, or if I talk of the experience of being like something, it means that it has to be something to be like that. Let us say I do not have the experience of say belonging to a different community or a different identity or a different gender. So we have to say that there must be something like being of that gender, of that identity, right? So he says that the belief that bats have experience is that there is something like to be the bat. Then he goes on to say in the lines that follow that bats perceive through sonar or echolocation. Then it goes on to describe how the brain operates. As you can see, this is the science or the mechanism of how perception happens, right? So this part of it is how they perceive. This generally does not contain any amount of any kind of analysis. It does not contain any kind of reasoning which we might want to use, right? So this is basically describing as to how the brains of the bats are designed. So what you can see from here is that they use sound, and what we do is vision. So humans use vision, bats use sound. Then he goes on to make the next point. He says that, but bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, so sound is a perception, it is not similar to any sense that we possess. And there is no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. So what he's saying here is that when you look at the sound or the sonar abilities of the bat, this is very different from any of the abilities that humans possess. You see, so human sense of sound, so the human ear does not perceive things the way the bat perceives sound, okay? So he says it is not similar, and therefore there is no reason to suppose that we can experience or imagine it. So I cannot imagine as to what the bat does because I cannot perceive things the way the bat perceives it, okay? You might notice that until now we have still not seen the problem, but now what follows is the problem. As you can see here, he says here that this creates difficulties, right? So now we've got our problem. This appears to create difficulties for the notion of what it is like to be a bat. This is our problem. The problem he is posing is that since the bat is so different, since its experiences are so different, its senses are so different, we cannot we cannot think of what it is like to be a bat. Okay, so he outlines the problem here, and then look at what he does thereafter. After this, he says that we must consider whether any method would permit us to extrapolate the inner life of the bat from our own case. Okay, and if not, what are the alternative methods for doing this? So now, as you can see here, he says that since we know that we can't have a lived experience of what the bat does because we don't experience and sense the world like the bat does, so is there any other method that can be used in order for us to understand the life of the bat from our own case? And if it is so, what is it? So this looks like what will be addressed in the next passage. So perhaps if I am now to think about my anticipation, what I anticipate is that they might discuss whether there is a method, and like he said, if not, what would be the method? Does a method exist? And what are the alternative methods, right? So he may either say that there are some methods, or he may say that it is not there. Now you have your anticipation again. Okay, so as you can see, we started off the second paragraph with the anticipation from paragraph 1. We finish paragraph 2 with an anticipation for paragraph 3, and we have the summary in 2 or 3 points of what is given in this paragraph. So I'm satisfied that I have comprehended this, and now I will go to the next passage, the next paragraph of this passage. So recounting what we've learned, the first paragraph spoke about the experiences of different species and how we can perceive them. And it says that it will discuss a problem. Paragraph 2 actually discusses that problem. So now we are looking at paragraph 3 to see as to perhaps how this problem may have been addressed. It may be the case or it may not be the case. Like I said, whether your anticipation is proved to be right or wrong does not matter. What matters is whether you had any anticipation or not. So we do have an anticipation, and now we look at what is given to us in this final paragraph. Now when you see this passage, and I think you should pause the video once and try it by your own self to identify as to what it is doing here. This paragraph also clarifies the problem for you very clearly. He says, but that is not the question. That means before this, he speaks something about what might look like the problem, but he says that this is not the question. Okay? He says his real problem is this. He wants to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Okay? So now you understand that his problem is it possible for me, a human being, to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat? This is the problem that has been summarized for you in the shortest manner. Okay, so it's important for you to see the context of this. And then what I'd expect is, so in the beginning here, he talks about something, then he says, but this is not the main question. Then he asks the question again, then perhaps this one would be addressing that. So now with this perspective, let's see it again. Okay, so he says in the beginning that our experience provides the basic material for our imagination, and since our experience is limited, therefore we cannot imagine what it is like to have a web on one's arms like the bats have, or to fly around at dusk and dawn catching insects, or perceiving the world through echolocation. So what he's saying is that since our experience is what allows us to imagine, right? Our imagination is also bound by our experience. Think of it like this. Perhaps if we had never even thought or experienced something, we cannot even imagine it, right? So he says that we are limited by our experience in our imagination, and since we cannot experience eating insects or traveling through echolocation, he says you can't necessarily be able to imagine what the life of a bat is. What he says is that you can only imagine what it would be like to behave as a bat behaves. So he says that I can behave as a bat behaves, but I cannot know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Okay, so he's saying that his question is deeper. It's not about doing what the bat does, but about feeling like what the bat feels. Then he goes on to say, even if he now wants to address this real question, he says, yet if I try to imagine even his real question here, again I am restricted to the resources of my own mind. So even if he wants to go beyond this behavior, he wants to go inside the head, again he is limited by the resources of his own mind, and those are inadequate for the task. What is the task? The task is to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. He says, I cannot perform it by either imagining additions or subtracting from it, or by imagining some combinations of additions, subtractions and modifications. So basically what he says is, no matter what he does, whether he adds to it, whether he subtracts from it, or whether he does a combination of these or modifies it, he says he cannot, okay, he cannot know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. Which means the problem was, can I know as to what it is like for a bat to be a bat? And finally you get the answer. The answer according to the passage is no. And he says so because your imagination of the experience of a bat is limited by your own experience. And since we cannot experience what a bat experiences and we cannot imagine it, therefore he says it is not possible for us to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. So let us quickly see as to what we've been able to gather from these three paragraphs. Okay, what we saw in the first paragraph was that we spoke of experience and the fact that different creatures have different kinds of experience, and he says he will introduce you to a problem, and that problem has been discussed in paragraph number 2, and in fact it has been further clarified in very clear words in paragraph number 3. So the problem is that since we are so different from a bat, since bats are so different from humans, is it possible for us to know as to what it is like for a bat to be a bat? And the answer that he gives to this problem is that it is not possible for us to know this. So this is what the passage is. Okay, now as you'd see, we spent quite a lot of time trying to arrive at this conclusion regarding this passage. It will not take you so long when you attempt this in the exam. This is the process that I've shown you, and you must follow this process whenever you solve a question on reading comprehension. Even if you solve, say, another 2 or 3 questions, right? You don't need too much practice. Even if you solve 2 or 3 questions using this technique and following this procedure, you'd find that you can start solving reading comprehension very easily. There are a few points I'd like to remind you once again before we end this lesson. First is that reading comprehension is not a test of English, right? Of course, it tests you on whether you've been able to understand what is said, but it is not a test of great English. Generally, an intelligent guess should be able to wade you across. You don't need to know as to what the precise meanings of words is. You can just go ahead even if you can make an intelligent guess. The next thing is that you should not be using any external material. So let us say you know something about bats, you know something about sonar. All of this data is actually harmful and dangerous for you. Do not bring in your knowledge from outside the passage to solve the questions. Everything that has to be solved is on the basis of what you have seen in the passage alone. So if the passage says here, for example, if the conclusion of the passage here is that you cannot know the experience of a bat as a bat, you can't bring your external knowledge that tells you that, okay, it is possible. You don't do that. You just accept what is told to you in the passage as the truth, right? So this is the truth, and once we are done with this, we go ahead and solve the questions. I'll end this video here. In RC5, we will solve the 5 questions based on this problem. Thank you.